Thank you, Pascal. We're going to resume our discussions with this first roundtable on the cyber risk. We'll be talking about the various types of threat. These are threats which are growing in importance. What is the impact on shipping? And what answers can be provided by people in insurance? We have a broker, Fabien PERRA, with us, your business manager, Cargo and Hull, Esotier Verlingue, an insurer, reinsurer, Didier PARSOIRE. You are in charge of cybersecurity for SCOR. We have a representative of ship owners, Pierre-Antoine Rojas, in charge of security and safety with Armateur de France. Thank you for replacing Jacques GERAULT, who couldn't come. And Xavier, your director of France CMA-CGM, set up a year and a half ago for the very purpose of addressing cybersecurity. Could we please close the door? So things are a bit less noisy. Let's talk about the status of this threat. I said that this threat is growing exponentially. Didier, could you talk about cyber threats in general before we refer more specifically to shipping? Yes, with pleasure. Good morning, everybody. I like to start talking about threats by telling you a short story. When the Internet Protocol was created in 1981, there were specifications, obviously, and it was said that security was an option that wasn't necessary. I like that because it illustrates the fact that as of the time we created the Internet Protocol, we had a worm in the fruit, so to speak. And when machines and computers started to communicate via networks, we created this cyber risk. The risk, of course, has now developed for any number of other reasons as well. If we look at the insurance market, which began at the ends of the 90s, the beginning of the year 2000, for about 15 years, the concern of brokers reflecting the main threat was the theft of data, the theft of personal data in particular, and what this might give rise to in terms of claims by third parties, compliance with regulations that existed at the time. I'm talking about the U.S. market, of course, because that's where cyber insurance was born. Compliance in terms of personal data and protection, that varies from one state to another. It was just a budding field at the time. And that was therefore the main focus, the theft of personal data. The business model of cyber criminals was the sale of personal data, financial data, health data on the dark web, on the dark net. And then there was a turning point which occurred around 2015. With the advent of these attacks in terms of ransomware. This was a paradigm shift when it comes to the kind of attack. We're talking about making the system unusable, about encryption. And you have to give the encryption key in exchange for a ransom. This is an attempt at extortion of a company, and most of these companies were at a total loss in the face of this kind of threat. The threat was highly disruptive, as we can still see today. Operations have to be shut down, or companies can only work in a degraded form. And the business model is much more profitable than data theft, because instead of getting money off a secondary market, you get money directly from the victim because you ask for a ransom. This ransomware has developed. To begin with, it affected everyone potentially, both private individuals and companies. And then ransomware as a service developed. That is, the task became more highly specialized. You have criminal gangs that develop the ransomware, the malware. Others identify the targets and then inject this ransomware into the target. And then you have this demand for ransom and insurance. Hence, there's been an increase in the frequency and the severity of these risks. People are ever more targeted. Ransoms are growing ever steeper. Could you give us a couple of examples of a ransom? Are we talking about several million euros? Well, it used to be a couple of €100, and now we're talking about several $1 million or tens of millions of dollars in ransom. The highest demand is about $50 million so far. We're talking about ransoms which are very, very steep, and the attacks are ever more disruptive, if not destructive. The average time of interruption in the space of 2 or 3 years has gone from a couple of days to a couple of weeks when operations can't run anymore. So we're talking about a huge loss of business for industry. That's the second layer, ransomware, which was added to data theft, which of course still exists, even if the proportion is somewhat lower. And there's a third point which is also important. 2017 was a turning point on the market with these attacks that we'll probably talk about it, Nacrai and Petya. These are very disruptive attacks, and also that signaled another part of cyber risk, the catastrophic nature of these risks. These attacks are very broad, and they can affect tens or hundreds of companies at the same time. That's a huge issue for the insurers. We have to be careful when talking about something as being systemic, but we do have this systemic theft. These catastrophic attacks can be seen over the past 2 or 3 years. We're talking about attacks on the supply chain. That affects not only the victims, but also the suppliers of services or IT solutions for the victims. And the attackers use this leverage effect. They attack a given supplier, and they then affect their clients, and the clients of those clients. So that, in a nutshell, is the current situation in general. Obviously, later on, we'll talk about the threat of war, given the current context in Ukraine. Cyril REBOUR and Xavier REBOUR, if we talk about the maritime world, what does this look like? I had a slide which I wanted to show you, and it's pretty self-explanatory. On this graph, you can see trends in the number of known cyber attacks, those that are published, documented, attacks that victims have actually talked about. Here you have trends in the world in shipping and port activities. In our team, we have someone who's been monitoring this for a long time and who provided the data. And he continues to monitor this data, and you can see this graph on our website. So what do you note? As of 2017 or 2018, there's been a huge upward trend owing to the digitalization of the shipping and port sectors. Now, if you look at the types of attacks, the front runner in terms of victims are those in port and maritime logistics. Then you have the ship owners, mainly services on not at sea. And then you have the offshore world. You have shipbuilders, you have defense. The Navy and the Indian Ocean had a lot of personal data that was stolen and sold on. We've talked a lot about ransomware. 50% of these attacks are linked to ransomware. One shouldn't forget that there's a risk of spying as well. We're in a very strategic sector for any given country, so one shouldn't forget spying or sabotage. I have some recent examples which illustrate the fact that if there is a conflict, you have sabotage as well. And then propaganda attacks, activists who want to convey a message. And here again, we have any number of examples of just this. If you go around the world, 30% of attacks concern the US, 10% France, 5% Germany, 5% Norway. And here I'm referring to the tip of the iceberg. These are documented attacks, visible ones. The vast majority are never talked about. As you were saying, a lot of attacks are not known because they're not necessarily declared. People are ashamed. When it comes to known attacks in the sector, could we have 2 or 3 names, things that we have read? that will remind us of the fact that this is a real threat. I'm not going to talk about Maersk, because everyone has that in mind. The Maersk attack that blocked 1/4 of container shipping in the world. This was an attack at the time of Russia was aiming to invade Ukraine. The idea was to attack a logistics supplier for the Ukrainian tax system, the idea being to bring down the tax collection in Ukraine. That was a very destructive virus. It wasn't ransomware, and it spread around the world in the space of 7 minutes. The 40,000 Maersk computers around the world were infected, and that affected some French industrial companies too. I'll give you an example per month in 2022, a characteristic example. In January 2022, there was an attack on the ports in the north of Europe, Hamburg, Ghent, Antwerp, and oil operators in these ports were attacked. The French ports were a bit shaken up. The operational center of France Cyber-Maritime gave some additional information over and above what port authorities provided. That made it possible to really properly assess the threat. February 2021, just after the triggering of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, a CASAT satellite network was attacked. CASAT is used by the Ukrainian land forces, and it's used by a lot of people in shipping and ports for communication. That was collateral damage of the attack. All the modems, the 30,000 modems were destroyed. That was in February. In March, a certain number of operators in the maritime transport service of the U.S. suffered from phishing attacks. People booked a container on a site, but it wasn't the real site, and they provided all their financial information to reserve a container, but it wasn't the right site. And in April, and there was a new kind of an attack. 95% of the information goes through submarine cables. That's a vast topic. And for the first time, there was an attempted attack, which the FBI discovered in time, targeting a Hawaii-based cable operator. And all the data goes through these underwater cables, not via satellites. And then the Port of London was attacked based on denial of service. That's a fairly basic activist propaganda kind of attack. So there's a lot of destruction, there's sabotage, there's ransomware, there's denial of service, plus the spying. Spying, which is on the whole very discreet, but which can affect big players in the maritime and port world. And the year isn't even over yet. In 2022, we stand at over 40 incidents. Last year, the number was about 30 at this time. Pierre-Antoine Rochas, what are the consequences when it comes to shipping and for ship owners? Just to react to what Xavier REBOUR said, we're talking basically about three main kinds of impacts on the activities of shipping companies. We have an impact on the very heart of the business, transporting merchandise or maritime services. As mentioned, we could talk about ransomware that may target the IT systems of shipping companies. In particular, there are some examples where the booking systems were attacked. A container transport company has a system to book freight transport or to book tickets if we're talking about a passenger line. The idea is to totally paralyze the booking system. The same kind of ransomware, as mentioned, can also target the port side of things, which is crucial for ship owners' activities. On the port side, you could target the systems that are used for forwarding, for the unloading or loading of containers. It's hard to assess the full impact of such attacks in monetary terms. Everything depends on the kind of ship or company attacked, the size, the scope of the systems impacted. One could talk in certain cases of several million euros in losses per day. That's a huge shortfall. There can be damage that has to be repaired because the system's been damaged, or there could be damages linked to the payment of the ransom. Second big category of impacts, direct or indirect attack on the safety of people and goods. Here we're talking about attacks which target the operational systems of vessels, all the onboard systems, the actual propulsion of the vessel, the systems used to drive the ship, to pilot it, and also the information systems for identifying the ship, positioning the ship, digital mapping systems which are used on board and which are essential when it comes to the safety of navigation. This kind of an attack will damage some safety issues. For example, the fire systems, the stability of the vessel, the safety of the cargo, container ship transporting dangerous goods or refrigerated goods, subject to special conditions. If you don't have all this data, then you don't really know what the status of the merchandise is. So the impact will be unending. You'll have an impact on the safety of the vessel in the long term. To a greater or lesser degree, you lose the indicators. You can't position the ship properly. You may run aground, for example. Likewise, there are further risks of the vessel actually sinking. The risk varies depending on the kind of vessel, the place the vessel is. When berthed, the risks won't be the same as in the open sea with rough weather. And then there are further consequences when it comes to shipping activities. The protection of data is very important. Shipping companies transport passengers, containers, and they process a huge amount of data, commercial data, personal data. The risk for a shipping company would be that this data is stolen, lost, destroyed. There's a financial risk. You'd have to reimburse the claims. And these are just a few of the attacks. If a shipping company doesn't have the past record of clients, of passengers, or doesn't have the booking date of the passenger, you can't allow the passengers to board, and you can't operate under normal conditions. Second risk, as we mentioned, and that's a key issue, you have the reputational risk. The risk that partners, customers lose confidence in the company. That's a very major stake for a shipping company. And I'll finish on one final point, which we've already mentioned, with more complex attacks and phishing to steal data. There's a real risk that personal data will be used fraudulently, or the identity of a decision maker in the shipping company may be usurped. Fraudulent use of data, banking information, that's very sensitive data. We're talking about huge sums of money when it comes to this kind of attack. Would you like to talk more about phishing? Well, phishing, I think that this is the kind of thing that affects everyone. An impact on a given player, well, it has a cascade effect on all the players in the chain. If a ship can't unload its containers, it's the whole logistics chain that's blocked when it comes to transporting the container, and the whole country is going to be impacted. It's a systemic effect. When one player is affected, it has a trickle-down effect on all. Would you like to react, Fabien PERRA? You know about the entire market. You can talk about risks and a growth in awareness, perhaps. Well, indeed, several people have referred to a systemic risk. Now we have to realize that the risk doesn't pertain solely to shipping. We're talking about something far more global and far-reaching. We have a representative of SCOR here, which testifies to the fact. We can wonder about the probabilities. Can we still insure against this risk? Some people are wondering not whether the risk will come, it's when it will arrive, as mentioned by Xavier earlier on. Our ship owners, port authorities, logisticians, everyone in the blue economy are directly impacted in this area. And when it comes to insurance, it's not an easy matter. Of course, subject to what the insurers here believe. It's not easy to quantify the risk. It's not easy at all to cover it. Why? Because as we saw in these examples, the target is not necessarily the target initially sought. One event at a given point in time can affect a whole range of people in the maritime area. I'll reformulate my question. Earlier on, you said that the cyber insurance market was quite small 10 years ago. Is it sort of dead now, or could we hope to be able to get coverage against this kind of risk? Is there still a cyber insurance market around? Well, the market has been around for about 20 years now, but it is changing. Initially, the problem was data theft, and the American market was the main target. And then around 2015, 16, 17, the insurance products were increased in number to take account of the material damage, that is the loss of business, interruption of service on the part of a given provider, ransomware, regulatory issues. The cyber area has become much broader over the past few years, and now coverage has become ever more complex because you have the damage, you have liability, you have the regulatory issues, and behind all this you have the problem of service and assistance, because that's really what counts. If there is a crisis, you need to know how to manage it. So this market has changed shape entirely. Now we have all these ransomware attacks. The market has been heavily impacted by the wave of new attacks. Hence, the market is asking all sorts of questions. It's becoming restructured. When it comes to those who buy insurance, it's a bit complicated. Premiums have increased considerably. They've doubled, if not more than doubled, on certain markets and for given risks. Conditions have become tighter when it comes to exposure to ransomware. The terms are more stringent, and above all, the market has contracted a little bit in terms of which is surprising because the risks are growing. So the market is actually growing. The market has to adapt to new risks. The risks itself constantly evolve. We're not talking about a stable range of risks. It's hard to quantify and model the risk, therefore. There's a risk of a real catastrophe. There are now systemic risks which are developing. This is something structural, and in the years to come, this will be a brake on the development of capacity. Now, the positive side, despite these current turbulences, is the fact that the market is learning. The market is learning a lot about the transfer of risk too. We've become more mature when it comes to the needs, how these needs can be formulated and identified by brokers, and then insurers better understand the risks. They can ask the right questions in order to select risks in a more relevant manner. Of course, we have a lot of work still to do, but we're at a virtuous stage in this circle, which will no doubt last for some time. Things are bound to improve. Well, I'm not going to provide an answer. I might just focus more on shipping, which is the topic of discussion for today. We understand the risk better. We have Armateur de France. We have MARITIME. It's very important to properly identify the problems and get a solution in insurance terms. Now, when it comes to the insurance for shipping, we've talked a lot about ransoms. So a number of questions are put currently. Will insurers still be authorized to compensate the payment of ransoms? I wanted to raise this question. Should you pay the ransom or not? Who'd like to answer that? Well, the states, regulatory authorities say one shouldn't pay the ransom. The state is doing its job. If you pay a ransom, that feeds a whole economy, a huge economy. If all the cyber criminals were a country, it would be the third biggest GDP in the world after the US and China. So imagine the money people are raking in. The advice is not to pay a ransom, but you can understand a company which is totally blocked and it pays the ransom. If you pay the ransom, it doesn't necessarily mean you'll get your data back, because the data have been sold on. And cyber criminals will ask for a second ransom in order not to sell on the data. So it's an endless thing. Cyber criminals aren't stupid. They do their own research work, and they ask for a ransom which is proportionate to turnover, because they're sure thus that the company will be in a position to pay. It's a whole business. It's a global business that we have now. So, Fabien, if you pay the ransom, that will be reimbursed? Well, the U.S. authorities are really wondering about this. Should one forbid insurance companies from reimbursing the ransom? In France, there was a group that thought about this matter under the Treasury last year, and some people in the room were present. The question was put. The answer is not a final one. The Council of Ministers last 16 March set up a draft bill which has not yet been voted in. Of course, we've been in an electoral period over the past few weeks. The idea is not to ban reimbursement of the ransom, but basically the idea is if you pay the ransom, if you're covered for the ransom, you'll be compensated, reimbursed, but providing you file a claim, a criminal claim, so that people know what's happening in terms of ransom. If you feed the ransom system, so to speak, because it's not just a question of cybersecurity, is it in your interest to pay the ransom? Okay, you'll minimize loss of business, but that might be paid back by the insurance company. It's a vast topic. No final solution has been found. There are all sorts of ethical issues as well. To date, it's not forbidden for insurance companies, even if some have decided not to do so, but they can pay back ransoms. So the insurability of this risk. We saw that the threat is growing exponentially. Didier talked about a doubling or a tripling of premiums. What's the situation today? Could we have a range to cover 5 million, 10 million? What's the current premium today? Or can you not even give a figure? Well, it's hard to answer because it depends on the size of the company, insured, the kind of activities, and the company's position when it comes to cybersecurity. Well, it's not so much the size of the company, it's also the quality of the risk in terms of cybersecurity, what the company has done about it to protect itself, but I don't have any actual figure to give you. Once again, let's be clear. We're trying to find the right kind of insurance for this kind of threat. We need to be profitable. There have been 2 years of losses in the world in the past 2 years, but the threat is evolving. We have to find the right levels. That's not the right answer. Perhaps the main answer, the most important one, is we need to improve cybersecurity. That entails regulations, guidance, good practices. I believe that insurance companies can also foster the growth of good practices in small and medium-sized companies. In particular, we need to address them in particular when it comes to cybersecurity. A certain number of things will make it possible to boost resilience. And then you have premiums which will adapt accordingly. How can players in shipping become better organized? Through you, perhaps. In 2018, The French state said something has to be done when it comes to shipping cybersecurity. A measure was announced by the Ministry of the Sea, and a working group, public and private, was set up in order to give thought to the matter. In 2019, Conseiller MARITIME was set up, chaired by a number of entities which deal with information security and the ministry and major operators in terms of shipping and cybersecurity. And this working group decided a few months later to set up an association which would bring together the shipping world, which has specific needs when it comes to cybersecurity, and the cybersecurity world. The idea is to find a suitable solution, and the upshot is France Maritime. That was the simplest, quickest way of getting things going and becoming truly operational. Will we remain a non-profit entity? I don't know. The purpose of France Maritime, of course, we're very young. We've been around for a year and a half. We want the maritime world, which has specific needs, to be better known by the cybersecurity world. The CMA, for example, has a lot in terms of cybersecurity. Other tiny little companies don't even have experts in cybersecurity. So we have to get everyone to meet together. And the shipping world needs to meet with the cybersecurity world. So there's increasing digitization of vessels and systems. And one of our other missions is to have an operational center, which is a lot of watchkeeping. We issue warnings, and we provide assistance and support. We're the emergency service in terms of cyber security, if you like. We do a lot of watchkeeping. We take our binoculars and keep an eye on the sea, and we provide specific alerts, warnings, and information. We can also send out an ambulance in the event of an attack. It's the beginning of this joint venture. We have 60 members, half from cybersecurity, half from shipping and port authorities. In a couple of years' time, we may have nearly 200 members. If that's the case, we'll have been successful. In any event, this is one of our activities. And of course, there will be many other activities carried out on a more local level or on a smaller scale. Pierre-Antoine Rochat, how do you go about your work in this area? Oh, we're involved in this structuring effort on the part of the nation. We have been representing ship owners in the various round tables, and at France Maritime, we're deeply involved too. There's a lot at stake. We have a lot of small structures. We have very small, 70% of our members are extremely small, and they benefit from this kind of service. And the big groups have much more resources. So anyway, we can propose solutions which are good for all different sized companies. We work on issues when it comes to the future of the market, regulatory matters. We've contributed to the thought process on the setting up of France Maritime. And with the French ship owners, we work with the General Directorate of Maritime Affairs and other government entities. We work on regulations prior to the entry into force of the IMO regulation on 1st January 2021. We needed to explain to companies what audits consisted in. Cyber security measures had to be brought in, and we did a lot of work with ship owners before the regulation was actually brought into force. The idea was to explain to people how things would pan out, and we needed to help them with this incipient regulation. We also worked a lot with the NC, which is the French entity for cybersecurity and the security of information systems. The aim is also to focus a lot on awareness building. And content produced is very interesting and relevant, even for small players. But the idea is to actually convey to the small players what the specific threats may consist in over and above the big companies. So we do a lot of awareness building. We work with the Navy and the Merchant Marine. The problems may be different, but these entities have a lot in common. We organize joint meetings where we discuss these matters all together in order to make progress.
Fabien, PERRA, maybe about regulation. We were talking about the French level, but at the international level, are there things that could happen as well? Well, for the moment, there's Resolution 428 of the IMO that Pierre-Antoine talked about that came into force on 1st January 2021. It's not a requirement for ship owners to update their information systems or information systems on crew members in order to agree with the resolution, but in the future they may be audited, as Pierre-Antoine said, and if the results were found lacking, maybe there could be sanctions, but I don't think it will get so far. You can't expect a ship owner now to both be the world champion in cybersecurity whilst being able to transport goods from point A to point B, whilst being able to handle fire risks, as we saw earlier. So putting sanctions in place that would culminate in suspending seaworthiness authorizations for ships regarding an IMO resolution, that is completely absurd. So we need to educate with the insurers, professional unions. They should all help ship owners understand the risk, and then they should help them simply constrain and confine this risk. And so there are assessment grids that are available from classification companies. They haven't waited for that. Then you could check all the onboard items, and then that might be a prerequisite. It's also a prerequisite now for some insurance guarantees to simply get access to the insurance world. I can see you're smiling. So yeah, I think that that made you tick. Well, maybe we won't get there, but we should get tools in place. This IMO regulation is not an obligation, but France took it to heart, and the Maritime Affairs Department is carrying out checks on shipping companies, and some shipping companies fail. And so what do? They call up France Cyber Maritime. I failed. What should I do? Help me. So that's also the goal of putting them in connection with people who do exactly that, risk analysis, helping them get a cyber policy together, and with people who are really in the know. Someone who's a cyber company that has never seen a boat in their life, that's going to be complicated. So you need people with a little bit of experience. So that's one of the goals of France Cyber Maritime. And so we've already helped some maritime companies that didn't know how to handle this issue, and companies big and small, by the way. I was going to ask you, what would be your concrete recommendations to improve security? Well, that was a good segue. What are the recommendations for the people who've heard that? What's your first recommendation? Well, my first recommendation is to make it strategic. That's for the executive board, for the chairman, the CEO, to handle security. But when I meet maritime operators, I'm interested in that. Discuss that with my chief information systems officer. That's problematic because they see that as a technical issue. It's not just a technical issue. That's the case of it's like a Breton quarters as well. It's a quarter policy, quarter technical matters, a quarter HR with awareness raising and training and practice, and it's also a quarter legal, regulatory, and compliance. Some operators, some vital operators, are faced with some constraints, and there's the Nice European Cybersecurity Directive that will apply to providers of essential services, and there's also GDPR. Only GDPR is a big obligation, so we know that it's a problem for management to tackle. Secondly, you also need to get GERAULT. People who don't know how to tackle this issue, they need to find a trusted third party that will help them first analyze the risk and then map out their network if they don't know what their information systems are, who's talking to whom, and what are the essential systems to protect. If you want to protect everything in cybersecurity, it's very, very costly. So you need to make a stock take, and then you need to express all the measures that are not necessarily technical, but also organizational, human, legal, and regulatory, and put them in place. So at France Cyber Maritime, we try to have this 360 view. So there's no magic antivirus that's going to solve all the problem. It's only handling a small bit of the problem. Fabien, PERRA, what would be your recommendations? Well, in light of what's just been said, well, support is key, and of course insurers should help their insured parties on that type of risk. Now, the cyber insurance market is mostly based on land, as we know, but there are difficulties in addressing the maritime insurance issues because the issues related to vessels straddle both land and sea. It's a differentiator compared to the fact that we now handle cyber risks via traditional insurance. So to put things clearly, there are aspects on exclusion clauses. We know that, well, brokers know that all insurance, damage insurance, include these 380 LMA 5403 and other anglicisms. So these clauses block these guarantees, but we know that these clauses are problematic in terms of their interpretation because they're based on the intent. So you can be guaranteed if you're able to prove that there was no intention to cause you harm. And when you can see that NotPetya affected Maersk, but Maersk was not targeted. And so these clauses do not protect. And so our insured parties really protected, all covered by these exclusion clauses. And then there's another market that's getting off the ground so that you can redeem these clauses, but also help ship owners when the event happens so that they can have the crisis units in place, so that they can pay ransoms in particular. We've talked about that already, to be able to guarantee loss of business and so on. But this issue is coming downstream. Upstream, the real issue is to identify the risk, to quantify it, to think together and create bridges between the insurance world, technical people, ship owners, and also, of course, cybersecurity companies. So my recommendation, to answer your question, is the same as Xavier's. We should work all together. Didier, PARSOIRE, what's the insurer's role? Well, I will agree with what was said. I agree both on the assessment of exclusion clauses, the improvements that have been made in the overhaul of the London market were fairly timid, especially on the issue of intent. It's always problematic. It's better managed in other business branches. I also agree to say that indeed we need to get everybody to work together, chief information security officers and operational managers. There needs to be an operational view of cyber risk, and then you can determine impact scenarios, and so we can start working on tailored insurance products and tailored guarantees. But then we need to think outside the box. Maybe we'll talk about that, but I think that digitalization, forced digitalization that's happening now is probably going to change the risk scope, and also as it applies to ships. So we should rethink the whole issue. Is the human aspect a real issue in prevention? Is that a question for me? That was a question directed to you, but it's absolutely crucial. I think that everybody agrees. Be it maritime business or other types of business, most of the time the weakest link is people. So anyway, attacks are about phishing, or somebody sending you an attachment and spreading a virus or malware. This is an essential aspect that we need to make our employees aware of. Pierre-Antoine, what would be your advice? Training and information, is that at the core what your members need to do? Absolutely. I'm going to echo what Xavier's just explained, and I'll focus on one quarter of that. The human aspect is crucial, but the organizational aspect inside the company is also crucial. Efforts will have to be made about access management, authentication factors to access workstations on land, and also organizational aspects and crisis management as well at the level of the shipping company. And so human aspects are central to what a shipping company does. Although crews are smaller and smaller, as are teams on land, but the human factor is essential. As Didier said, it's also a vulnerability. There should be efforts made in terms of awareness raising, also in strategic terms, but at every level, because all users will be affected. So we need to instill a real culture of maritime cybersecurity within companies, whereas usually people think about managing traditional risk for vessels, for instance. And there's also a challenge in terms of training. Maybe with the development of new tools, we have fairly specific constraints in the maritime sector. Crews are worldwide. They're not always able to go to training centers, as could be the case for land-based companies. So you should have e-learning or distant module tools. There also are recruitment problems. Resources are scarce and expensive. So you need to find the best requirement for shipping companies. Not all shipping companies need to have a cyber department. You need to find tailor-made solutions to adjust to the diversity. Well, that's almost the end of this discussion. We've heard a lot of practical advice, but if we were to take on board but one thing, what would it be? What would be the motto? The essential message that you would take home, Didier? Well, I think that that echoes our discussion. We need to break down silos. And that's particularly true in the maritime sector. This sort of dichotomy between what's on land and what's at sea, we haven't really talked about that, but the dichotomy between information technology and industrial technology that you use to run the ships, you can see that both universes are interpenetrating each other more and more. And there's also a dichotomy in insurance between the products. So a guarantee buyback that is more material, but cyber policies deal with the intangible aspects of the risk. And then there's between maritime underwriting and cyber underwriting teams, you need more and more communication. With digitalization and connectivity impacting all systems, that's abolishing the border between the physical and the IT worlds. Fabien? I would go even further. Since we're in Paris, it's a French market now, but I can look at my friends in the front row. Now we could have a French guarantee with French insurers that would break down silos, as Didier said, between the world of non-life and the world of maritime, and not necessarily just for French insurers. That's the point I would highlight, because solutions are around in London or Norway or elsewhere. There's a lot of brain power in this room. People really want to do things, but we don't yet have the products in France. Pierre-Antoine? Well, we are organizing the answer for maritime companies. French maritime companies have really tackled this project, and we are working on a response. And so the solutions, whether they're technical, regulatory, or training solutions that could be developed, they should be really adapted to the diversity of shipping companies. We are lucky in the ship owner sector. We have all segments of the fleet represented, and all businesses are represented with different sizes of companies. So the challenge is to offer them bespoke solutions to help them and support them within the maritime ecosystem, which has a lot of solidarity. Xavier, REBOUR, to conclude. Well, I agree we need to break down silos because we are stronger together, but together we need to discuss and share regularly. That's essential. A cyber attack is not a disease. It is something to be ashamed of. If we got caught, we need to avoid our friends getting caught, because the whole French maritime sector and the whole French cyber sector should win. So compared to the rest of the world and compared to cyber criminals that are operating from abroad very often. So I'm preaching for the parish. And so France Cyber Maritime is a trusted third party that will collect information but also anonymize it and disseminate it. And so things that are technically useful and are not going to wag the finger at anyone. So very often, well, we are stronger together. We need to share together. We need to discuss, because individually we're not going to be able to succeed. That's what I wanted to say to conclude. Well, thank you very much to all of you.